Here we are with our Sunday school lesson for Sunday, August the 24th. And fall is officially here now. I know there's been a lot of people talking during the extremely hot weather we had that they couldn't wait for the Burr months, and we're now in the Burr months, September, October, November, December. And the weather is fantastic. I mean, as I'm recording this lesson today, it was about 62 degrees outside, and I went out this morning, and it's absolutely beautiful. But we give thanks for every day. We give thanks for every day because every day is special. Every day is given to us by God to do something special with. Our lesson today is a great parable. It's a parable that we're familiar with. There's a lot about it that we're having a discussion this past week after Sunday school about this coming lesson, about the one we have today, and about some things in it that don't just resonate with us immediately. We have to give some thought to, and that's so true of so many things in the Bible. The lesson today, the title is How to Host a Dinner Party. The focal passage comes from Luke 14, and it covers Luke 14, 1 through 34. The purpose statement is to discover the meaning of everyday humility and generosity according to Jesus. And it's an important lesson. It's a familiar parable. And as I say, it's a parable that we need to be reminded of on a daily basis. It needs to be part of our thought process. It needs to be part of who we are. And humility is such an important thing. It's critical to who we are. We're going to talk about that in a little more detail. So I'm going to go ahead and read the lesson today. It comes from Luke 14, and it begins in Luke 14:7. When Jesus noticed how the guests sought out the best seats at the table, he told them a parable. When someone invites you to a wedding celebration, don't take your seat in the place of honor. Someone more highly regarded than you could have been invited by your host. The host who invited both of you will come and say to you, "Give your seat to this other person." Embarrassed, you will take your seat in the least important place. Instead, when you receive an invitation, go and sit in the least important place. When your host approaches you, he will say, "Friend, move up here to a better seat." Then you will be honored in the presence of all your fellow guests. All who lift themselves up will be brought low, and those who make themselves low will be lifted up. Then Jesus said to the person who had invited him, "When you host a lunch or dinner, don't invite your friends, your brothers and sisters, your relatives, or rich neighbors. If you do, they will invite you in return, and that will be your reward. Instead, when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you. Instead, you will be repaid when the just are resurrected." When one of the dinner guests heard Jesus' remarks, he said to Jesus, "Happy are those who will feast in God's kingdom." And Jesus replied, "A certain man hosted a large dinner and invited many people. When it was time for the dinner to begin, he sent his servant to tell the invited guests, 'Come, the dinner is now ready.' One by one, they all began to make excuses. The first one told him, 'I bought a farm and I must go and see it. Please excuse me.' Another said, 'I bought 5 teams of oxen and I'm going to check on them. Please excuse me.' Another said, 'I just got married, so I can't come.' When he returned, the servant reported these excuses to his master. The master of the house became angry and said to his servant, 'Go quickly to the city streets, the busy ones, the side streets, and bring the poor, crippled, blind, and lame.' The servant said, 'Master, your instructions have been followed, and there is still room.' The master said to the servant, 'Go to the highways and back alleys and urge people to come in so that my house will be filled. I tell you, not one of those who were invited will taste my dinner.'" Now we read that, and we say the discussion we had was how do we go about doing that? How do we, from a practical standpoint? So we're going to talk about some of those things as we look at this lesson today. Jesus chose this illustration, this parable, to point out an eternal truth. If a quite undistinguished guest arrived early at a feast and took the top place, and if a more distinguished person then arrived and the man who had taken the first place was told to step down, it creates a horribly embarrassing situation for everybody. If, on the other hand, a person deliberately slips into the bottom place and then was asked to occupy a more distinguished place, his humility gains him all the honor. Humility has always been one of the best characteristics of a great person. Think about it. Think about the people you know. Think about the people that you have encountered in your life. And I say this often, that our lives, as our faith journey, as we look back over our life, there are people that have come into our lives that have impacted us in a very special way. And they impacted us, if you really think about it, because of their humility. I mean, we've all been in the presence, we've all been around people who were important, however you define importance. It could be an elected official, it could be somebody who was with a high position in a company, it could be an athlete, a great athlete. But the ones that you remember, in a very special way are those that were humble. I'm going to share a quick story, and it's about somebody. I typically don't do this. I don't talk about specific people that I have known. But this past week, I had the opportunity to visit with somebody. I'd never met him before. His name was Roosevelt. And Roosevelt and I were talking about what each other had done for a living as we were raising our families and the things we were involved in. And he told me about a project in Charlotte, North Carolina that he was working on. He was having a lot of trouble with it. He was was not able to get any traction. And he happened to be a minority, and that was giving him additional challenges. And he heard about a group of men in Charlotte who were very influential, and they got a lot of publicity. They were a group of men that would get together, and they made a huge difference. One of them was a man by the name of Cliff Cameron. Cliff was chairman of one of the largest banks in the country. And he was somebody that along with a few other men had brought professional football, professional basketball to Charlotte. They had built buildings, they had created communities. I mean, they say they're very, very influential people. And Roosevelt said that he finally got the nerve to go visit with Mr. Cameron. And he called and was able to get an appointment. And he said he was scared to death. He said, I didn't know what to expect. Here's somebody that everybody knew his name. Everybody knew who he was. He was chairman of one of the largest banks in the country. And he said, when I went in and I sat down with him and I started to share the challenges that I had, he shared with me some of the things that he had heard about my project. And that project, it wasn't true. And he said, we talked about it some more. And he said, ultimately, he said, I now understand. I'm going to help you. And he did, and the project got built. But he was talking about, had he not done that, had he not gone in the presence of Mr. Cameron, and had Mr. Cameron not been so humble, he said, I just knew that I was there with somebody that saw me as an important person also. And he said, it changed my life forever. He said, I've never forgotten it. And he said, I tell the story often. I share stories about my father. I can't help but think, and of course, you know, I knew my dad for over 71 years, and he was my dad. But hearing stories from people over the last several weeks about coming to see him about things, asking him questions, there were stories that I guess I knew, but to hear people share them and the way they shared them has really touched me. And I'll never forget my father, and he said this, and I can remember it for as long as I live, that he was talking about the people that he had interacted with, the people that he had met, and very influential people. He attended presidential inaugurations. You know, my mother had lunch with first ladies. And he said, David, don't ever forget that everybody in the morning when they get up, they put their pants on one leg at a time. I've never forgotten that expression. And it's the people that are humble. The people that are humble and recognize that they may have had other opportunities that some didn't have. And that's all it was. God gives us gifts. They utilized the gifts that He gave them to make the best of whatever situation they were in. That's humility. And how do we retain humility? I think as we look at this lesson, I think we retain it by realizing the facts. No matter how much we know, we still know very little compared to the sum of all knowledge. No matter how much we've achieved, we still have achieved very little in the end. However important we may believe ourselves to be, when death removes us, Or when we retire from a position, life and work goes on just the same without us. I think, and Judy and I were talking about it the other day, we're talking about dementia, talking about Alzheimer's, and I think about, and I've thought about this often, Ronald Reagan, who certainly in my lifetime, to me, was the greatest president that I've ever had the honor of knowing and of having served our country. And yet Ronald Reagan died from Alzheimer's. And I think about, in the end, what that must have been like. How he was a respected world leader, how he had accomplished so much for so many. But at the end, it didn't make any difference, and the world would go on. We can retain humility by comparing ourselves with the perfect. It's when we see or hear an expert that we realize how poor our own thinking is, our own performance is. I laugh. I used to go with my buddies, and we would go to golf tournaments. We're professional golfers. We played golf 2-3 times a week. And we got to thinking we were pretty good. You get your handicap down in the single digits, down to 7 or 8 or 9, you think you're pretty good. And then you go to a golf tournament where the PGA players are playing, and you realize you're really not that good at all. I think about music. You think you're pretty good. You're in the band. I'm in the high school band. I've got my own little combo. We're pretty good. And then we hear a master musician, and we think we're really not all that good at all. I think about the number of teachers, the number of speakers who have become humbled when they hear a great teacher or they hear a great speaker, that maybe we've got some improving to do. If we set our lives beside the life of the Lord, if we see and we recognize our unworthiness in comparison with His purity, pride will die and self-satisfaction will be shriveled up. Now, as we look further in this passage, I think it's important that we look further and examine the motives behind our generosity. I think it's important to look at that. I think this passage talks to that. There are some people, and I dare say I've been caught in that trap in the past, and as I reflect back on my life, that we give out of a sense of duty. I heard a short poem, and it stated, "He dropped a penny in the plate and meekly raised his eyes, glad the week's rent was duly paid for mansions in the skies." I'm reminded of a friend, and I think I've shared this before, when I was in college, and we did go to Sunday school or church as a group, and we went to different services. One of my friends was Roman Catholic, and sometimes we'd go to Roman Catholic. I had a Jewish friend. Sometimes we went to the synagogue. It was whatever. Mostly we went to the Methodist church in town. But when I think about that, my friend one time said, "I go every week. I make sure that I go every week because I want my name checked off the box that I was there." And to him, that was his entry. That was his entry into heaven. We sometimes give to God and to others much in the same way as we pay our income taxes. We have this duty, and once we've paid it, we have this grim satisfaction that we have done our duty, and somehow or other that's going to buy us entry into heaven. A person may give purely from motives of self-interest, consciously or unconsciously. We may regard giving as an investment. I'm making an investment in my soul. We may regard each gift as an entry on the credit side of an account that we've got in the ledger with God. Such giving, so far from being generous, is rationalized selfishness when we really think about it. A person may give in order to feel superior. It can hurt the recipient much more than a blunt refusal. When a person gives like that, he stands on his eminence and he looks down on that person. It would be better not to give at all than to give merely to gratify our own vanity and one's own desire for power. The rabbis had a saying that the best kind of giving was when the giver did not know to whom he was giving and when the receiver did not know from whom he was receiving. And I think about that. I think about the fact that I remember a good friend of mine, and he would always give. There would be things that we gave to. There would be projects that we thought made a whole lot of sense with our church, with our community, with a YMCA or whatever it was, and they gave you recognition. You could get your name on a plaque with a certain size gift. And I'll never forget, this one friend always gave anonymously. He didn't care to be recognized. It wasn't important to him. And he gave significant gifts anonymously. Some people give just because they can't help it. And if you think about it, that's the only real way to give. I think about a Christian ministry, and I love this program. I've mentioned it before. It's called Bright Blessings. It's a program that gives birthday parties for children in school that otherwise cannot have a birthday or don't have the ability to have a birthday. And they go into the schools and they provide a birthday for that child. And one thing that they learn very quickly, if you think about it, go to a child's birthday and watch. The children love to give. It's part of our nature. It's part of how we grew up. We want to give. And the child who was being given the birthday wanted to give something back. So then they started learning they needed to take party favors so the birthday child could turn and give back. Children love to give because that's the way we're created. The law of the kingdom of the Lord is that if a person gives to gain reward, he will receive no reward. But if a person gives with no thought of reward, his reward is certain. The only real giving is that which is the uncontrollable outflow of love, and we share that love with others in our giving. If we think about it, God so loved the world that he gave his Son. And so we must be thinking the same way. We must have the same attitude. Our lesson then finishes up with the king's banquet and the king's guests. The Jews had a series of pictures of what would happen when God finally broke into history and when the golden days of the New Age arrived. And one of those pictures was of the Messianic banquet. On that day, God would give a great feast to his people. It is of this banquet that the man Jesus is speaking to is talking about. When he spoke of the happiness of those who would be guests at that banquet, he was thinking of Jews. And of Jews only, for the average Orthodox Jew would never have dreamed that Gentiles and sinners would find a place at the feast of God. That is why Jesus spoke of this parable. In Palestine, when a man made a feast, the day was announced long beforehand. Invitations were sent out and were accepted. But the hour was not announced. And when the day came and all things were ready, servants were sent out to summon the already invited guests, to accept the invitation beforehand and then to refuse when the actual day came was an insult. In this parable, the master stands for God. The originally invited guests stand for the Jews. Throughout all history, they had looked forward to the day when God would break in. And when he did, they tragically refused his invitation. The poor people from the streets stand for the tax gatherers and sinners who welcomed Jesus in a way in which the Orthodox Jew did not. Those gathered in from the roads and the hedges stand for the Gentiles, who there was still ample room for after the banquet was filled. Barclay, who I often refer to, points out that there is one sentence in this parable which has been misused. "Go out," said the master, and compelled them to come in. Barclay, and I thought this was interesting, shared that long ago Augustine used that text as a justification for religious persecution. It was taken as a command to coerce people into the Christian faith. And it was used as defense for the Inquisition, the rack, the threat of death, imprisonment, the campaigns against heretics, all those things which are the shame of Christianity. Besides, if we should always set another text before us, the love of Christ controls us. In the kingdom of God, there's only one compulsion, the compulsion of love, and that comes from Corinthians. But though this parable spoke with a threat to the Jews who had refused God's invitation, and with an undreamed of glory to the sinners and the outcasts, the Gentiles who had never dreamed of receiving it, there are in it truths which are true for us today. In this parable, the invited guests made their excuses. And if you think about it, our excuses are not much different. The first man said that he had a field, and he was going to go tend to his field. It's still possible for us to be so immersed in our daily life, in our daily business, that everything that's going on in the world, that we no longer take time to worship. Sometimes we don't even take time to pray. The second man that Jesus talked about said he had 5 yoke of oxen, and he was going to tend to them. He let the claims of novelty keep him from the claims of Christ. It often happens to us. when we allow possessions to get in the way of our worship with God. Sometimes we get so wrapped up in the stuff that we have that we spend more time with the stuff than in worshiping the Lord. I mean, think about it. I heard a story not too long ago of a couple. They'd just gone and bought a new car, and on Sundays they said, now we enjoy driving off. The weather's been so wonderful, we go off in our new car and we travel. We go down to the coast or we go to the mountains. It may be a new hobby. It may be a new friendship. Whatever it is, we take time away from God for some new activity that gets in the way. The third man said, with even more finality than the others, I have married a wife and I cannot come. And that comes from Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy it says, when a man is newly married, he shall not go out with the army or be charged with any business. He shall be free at home for 1 full year to be happy with his wife whom he has taken. Now, no doubt in this story, the man wanted to spend time with his wife, and there's nothing wrong with that. To be dedicated to each other, to spend time, to fully embrace each other, be totally committed to each other for that first year, which only can be strengthened then into the second, the third, and the fourth year. But we can't do that by turning away from God. So before we wrap up this passage, I think it's important that the most significant thing that Jesus thought of is in his kingdom and in his service was to describe it as a feast. It's important. Jesus used a feast. He gathered people together, they worshiped together, and then they had a meal. And we do that. Don't we love to get together with people? Don't we love to get together over a meal? And when we do that, you're not there grumbling. When you're enjoying, you're having a feast. You're sharing with each other, you're laughing, you're telling stories, you're enjoying fine food. And that's what Jesus is saying that the great banquet is going to be like. And I had a good friend of mine, Jim Holderness. He was a minister in the Presbyterian Church. We became very close friends with Jim and his wife Jenny. We traveled to Europe with them. And I'll never forget a sermon that he gave one time talking about communion, talking about the banquet, talking about the great banquet that we would all be at someday, and the fact that we would be shocked about some of the people that were there. Just like the Jews would have been shocked that there were Gentiles, there were sinners, there were tax collectors at the great banquet. It's an important thing for us to think about, my friends. Our passage today tells us that a gloomy Christian is a contradiction in terms. That there is no greater Christian than one who is willing to share, to laugh, to give, and to participate in the wedding feast and enjoy others and ask others to enjoy that feast with them. Will you pray with me, my friends? Our gracious Heavenly Father, we give you thanks for today. We give you thanks for this parable. It's so special. It's so important. We do know that as we go throughout each day, we keep our eyes open to the things you want us to see, our ears open to the things you want us to hear, our hearts overflowing with that love you've put in each and every one of us. We know that we're to give that love away, and no matter how much we give, we're supposed to continue to give more because you will always provide more for us to give. We give you thanks. We give you thanks for everything that you have provided us. In His name we pray. Amen. I love you, my friends, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.